Hi Math, I'm Andy. What's the difference between -1 squared and the quantity of -1 squared? Well, this really comes down to the order of operations, parentheses, exponents, multiply, divide, add, and subtract. When we look at a -1, think of it this way. A negative number is really a multiplication problem. It is -1 times that number itself. So when we think of -1 squared, really what's happening is we have a negative value that's being multiplied by some base number, and that base number is being raised to an exponent. So when we follow our order of operations, we're actually required to do the square first, then do the multiplication. 1 squared is 1, and -1 times 1 is -1. But when we look at -1 in a parentheses squared, what we do is follow the order of operations again. So we actually perform the multiplication first. So this provides us with a negative value, a -1. And the squared tells us to take that value in the parentheses and multiply itself 2 times. -1 times -1 produces a +1. So let's look at some numbers. For instance, -4 squared, and we'll look at -4 quantity squared. So again, this comes down to our order of operations. -4 squared is really -1 times 4 squared. And we follow our order of operations first. We do the exponents before we do the multiplication. 4 squared is 16, and -1 times 16 is -16. Now, when we look at the quantity of -4 squared, what we're really doing here is we are taking that value of -4, because we really are completing the -1 times 4, and we're timesing it by itself twice. And a negative times a negative is a positive. So again, the difference between -1 squared and the quantity of -1 squared really comes down to the order of operations. We perform the exponent before we perform the multiplication. Where here, because it's parentheses, we perform the multiplication before we perform the exponent.